everyone. Good afternoon, good evening. My name is Lynn Sorrentino. Welcome to the next in the series of the Plover Rovers special webinars and discussions around different things about the coast and coastal living and marine science and the ocean. And I'm going to turn off my camera now and start the presentation. Today we're going to talk about my terribly exciting quantifying linkages between coastal flooding, human health, mental well-being, which is what I did for my MSc thesis, and it was an analysis of the 2016-2017 National Survey for Wales, and I focused on a few Welsh coastal communities. So the objectives of today's talk are to share with you a little bit of the content of my thesis that I received from Bangor University in the topic of marine environmental protection, and share with you the value of the national survey data that I received from the Welsh government. Share with you as well why coastal flooding research itself matters, and discuss the environmental, social, and emotional impacts of the risk of increased flooding on people that are living in coastal communities. The picture that I'm starting off with is a photo from the Creative Commons from New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. And as I was growing up in America, mostly in California, and some of my time was spent in Seattle, Washington, I did experience flooding a few times myself. Nothing to the extent of what happened after Hurricane Katrina, certainly. But when that happened in 2005, I was able to actually go to New Orleans 6 months afterwards to help with some of the cleanup efforts. And seeing how damaged the city was, even 6 months after, and the complete failure of government to deal with it beforehand and after, was part of what motivated me to do this topic for my thesis, was just to see how the impact was on so many people and how it is such a distressing thing to happen. So why coastal flooding research matters specifically is when we look at the populations of coastal areas, they're increasing and they've continued to increase. Most countries, if they are coastal or have a coast, have the majority of their bigger cities on coasts. And there's a societal need to determine whether or not people are worried, if they're concerned about flooding, and whether or not that alters their health or mental well-being. As we know, there's quite a lot of concern too around climate change and the mental health impacts of climate change, creating a lot of stress for people. And so I focused on this primarily because coastal communities are on the front lines of climate change. And coastal flooding threatens the community cohesion, it threatens local economies, and the overall health and well-being of people that are living, on or near the coast. And in my case, it was the Welsh coast. And within Wales and within the UK, everywhere within about 50 miles of the coast is a flood zone, and in terms of coastal flooding. And in Wales in particular, looking at some of the flood zone maps, the entire country is a flood zone, including, not Snowdonia and that area where it's high mountains, but including inland areas. So for me, the topic was really to understand what people worried about in terms of their flood risk and how that affected their health and well-being and the community cohesion within the coastal cities. So my original set of 4 hypotheses were that flood risk concern would negatively relate to their well-being, that it would also negatively relate to their health, and that flood risk awareness, like their understanding that they lived in a flood zone, would be positively related to social community cohesion. So if everybody in the community knew that they were in a flood zone, that they would understand that, they would probably be more connected to their communities and to the community members that they lived with. And finally, also that their flood risk awareness would negatively relate to material deprivation. And so when I was doing this research, I was looking at a number of variables, and I've focused on a few here. This is certainly not all of them. My paper is available on ResearchGate in its entirety, so you're welcome to get bored reading the whole thing if you want. But the variables that are important were, again, flood risk awareness. And in the national survey for Wales, the flood risk awareness questions were asked in 2016 and 17 and in 2017 and 18. And the way the questions were asked was whether or not people were concerned or not about flooding to their home, their local area, so their community, or to other parts of Wales. I looked also at demographics, specifically gender, their age groups, marital status, and education levels. I looked at their health, which was a self-reported variable. So people told the surveyors whether they were in very good, fair, bad, or very bad health. Their mental well-being, which is something that was measured by the Warwick Edinburgh Mental Wellbeing Scale, which I will cover in a little bit more detail. And this is a very powerful set of questions that there's 14 questions on the Webems is what Webems is the acronym for it, that do tend to provide very strong statistical results when asked properly. Then I looked at as well deprivation of adults and pensioners in material deprivation and social community cohesion, whether or not people felt like they belonged to their local area. So the Webems, which again is not how you pronounce that acronym, I know, but to me in my head, that's how I pronounce it. It's a series of statements where people tell you how they're feeling. Are they optimistic about the future? Are they feeling useful? Are they feeling relaxed? And they rate these 14 statements by a score of 1 to 5, and then you end up with an overall average score. And the higher score you have, it means you're actually really doing well. If you have a very low score, you're not doing very well. And there's a link in the slides, which again, the slides will be available afterwards as well, with the links for this and for the paper to share with you a little bit more in detail about it. It's a very robust, proven tool and is used quite extensively by the overall UK ONS, the Office of National Statistics, as well as the different country governments. So my study area, again, was Wales. And I was looking at this survey data that covered all of Wales. But of course, if I was looking at coastal flooding, I was not interested in folks that were living inland or by the border or things like that. So what I wanted to do was break down the data and then focus on the coastal areas and specifically focus on 6 of the Welsh communities in Rhyl, Colwyn Bay, Aberystwyth, Llanelli, Neath, and Newport. And please forgive my bad Welsh. So the data that I was looking at was again from the National Survey for Wales from 2016, 2017. And I really do want to thank, of course, Elizabeth Morris-Webb of Bangor University for the methodology that she helped me with, that I've detailed in my appendix, of really how to break down the data by location. And so what I did was I took the data, and there were nearly 11,000 respondents of the whole survey. And then I took the subset of the flood risk concern respondents, which was 2,600 people. And then I broke that down into the coastal Welsh residents, which was the flood risk concern residents living exactly by the coast. And then the third group was the ones directly touching the coast. They were living absolutely right in a coastal community. So the coastal ones were within 10 kilometers and the other ones were within, like, basically right there on the coast. So my data sets were all relatively small, but still powerful enough for statistics. And my statistics guru was Elizabeth Gabe Thomas of Plymouth University, who gave me lots of really, really good advice on stats. So after looking at all this data and looking at the mental well-being stats, the overall scores for that, the social cohesion, et cetera, the results I ended up getting were quite interesting and pretty much did support my hypotheses that looking at flood risk concern, it revealed significant positive and negative relationships across the board, which I will share in this slide when we get to that. But that it also showed that mental well-being had mixed results for the impact of flood risk concern. And the only significant relationships that were really found that were really, really strong related to health and tenure. So if you owned your home or you had lived for a long time in the home, your health was generally better. And the location as well mattered in terms of flood risk concern. So again, if they were living by the coast, they were definitely more concerned. Additional results were the combination between flood risk awareness and social community cohesion. All of the subsets of data, so all three subsets, showed a positive correlation where if they were very aware of their flood risk, they were also very engaged with their community. And individuals that were in material deprivation, which specifically looked to their overall, it's a complicated set of data describing deprivation, but if they were concerned about making a living and getting by, they had lower levels of awareness because they were too worried and focused on actually surviving because they were in deprivation. So that was quite interesting as well. And it did prove out that they weren't secure, so they weren't as aware either. The study also found that mental well-being and health were affected by flood risk concerns specifically. So people that reported that they were very or fairly worried about flooding risk to their property, they had an overall lower mean mental well-being score than those who were not as concerned. And then finally, a similar trend also appeared for self-reported health levels. A negative effect on health was demonstrated for those who worried more about flood risk, but the effect was very weak, so it wasn't quite significant. And here is a chart from my paper that shows you at the top, we've got flood risk concern and mental well-being, and flood risk concern and health. And if they're, depending on their age band, it was both positive and negative impacts. Gender was definitely negative, and in this case, it was for women. Education, same thing, positive and negative. Marital status, if they were single, it was definitely negative, whereas if they were married, they had a better overall mental well-being score. Tenure was negative for both. So again, if they had not lived very long or did not own their house, it was proven negative that, or proven, it was shown to be negative that they were more worried about flood risk concern. And then mental well-being and health was, of course, positive. If they were positive about their health, they were generally positive about their mental well-being. And then when I looked at the location, again, all of Wales, coastal or touching the coast, again, comparing flood risk awareness, how aware they were of whether or not they were in a flood zone, and social community cohesion, all of those were positive for all three locations. And then again, looking at the material deprivation side of things, if they were in material deprivation, their flood risk awareness was low, and generally that was negative. And so in terms of discussion points for today, what I wanted to share too is that my thesis is very limited in perspective. It really underscored for me looking at some of the things happening in Wales with the poverty plans, the future of the Well-Being of Future Generations Act, the increased and more severe coastal flooding that was happening in Wales or generally in the UK, that all of this creates a nexus for research that needs to go into, I think, human health and well-being for coastal communities, because as we see with generally with climate change, the storms are becoming more severe, more frequent, and causing greater damage. So basically, coastal flooding is more than just a set of recurring natural disasters. Yes, there's coastal flooding that happens. I mean, if you look at or watch on Twitter or look at the Welsh flood alert networks, pretty much every day for 6 months a year or more, there's a flood alert happening somewhere in Wales. And so looking at that and looking at the historical, the geographical, the social components, all of these things impact vulnerable individuals and the communities they live in. The health and mental well-being aspects of this are connected to the environment as well. This is something else that has been proven out by a number of research studies, particularly by Matt White. People that live near blue or green environments, so live near the coast or live near a forest, they generally have better mental health and better health overall. But when you're in a position where you're constantly worrying about flooding, that benefit goes away. The flood risk reduction efforts that are going on in Wales, the increased outreach and education that is happening, these are these two groups of actions that are being taken by Welsh government offices as well as Welsh communities. They're sets of many actions that really can address some of these challenges. And people within Wales, from what I understand, quite a lot of the communities are really pulling together to understand coastal flooding, work on their coastal flood defenses, work on their preparation of their community members, etc. So that's good news. And part of what I wanted to also discuss was that if you're in a community where you're more connected to your neighbors and these communities can be then more resilient, that really does help avert some of the severe impacts of climate change. The flooding, especially that happened, for example, this is again New Orleans, and taken, I think, 3 days after Katrina hit. This kind of situation where you've got literally entire communities underwater, if you are at all connected to your community, you're going to have a better outcome generally than if you're not. And certainly, as we've seen with numerous floods over the last, well, it's been 16 years now, it's proven out to be true again that, the efforts that we put in to protect our communities and to work together and to plan for these things really does help.